We begin, as we always do, with the truth plainly told. At 18 years old, Adeline Marsh owned nothing but the clothes on her back, a canvas satchel with 2 changes of linen, and $2.35 wrapped in a handkerchief that had belonged to her mother. She had been put out of the only home she had ever known by her uncle Warwick Marsh, a man who had inherited her late father's boat repair shop on a technicality of paperwork and who informed her, without much ceremony, that a niece by marriage was not family enough to keep feeding through a Missouri winter. She had $2.35, a set of her father's old carpentry tools, and nowhere in the world that wanted her. And so, on a gray October morning in the river town of Larkspur Landing, in the year 1888, she walked to the courthouse steps and, for $2 even, bought the one thing in town that nobody else would touch, the collapsed, condemned, long-abandoned ferry dock at the bend of the Missouri River. A ruin of rotted pilings that the town clerk was delighted to be rid of. Everyone who watched her sign her name to that deed believed they were witnessing the final, foolish act of a girl with nothing left to lose. They had no way of knowing that beneath those rotted boards lay a secret sealed away for 11 years, a secret that would not only save her, but would return to an entire town something it had quietly, shamefully forgotten it once had. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Adeline Marsh. If you are watching this from a place that feels forgotten too, a town, a house, a piece of yourself, tell us in the comments where you are watching from tonight. Adeline had been born on the river, in the truest sense of the phrase. In a clapboard house so close to the Missouri's edge that her earliest memory was the creak of her father's ferry ropes and the particular green smell of the water in springtime. Her father, Thomas Marsh, had not owned the ferry. That distinction, and the toll rights that came with it, belonged for decades to a quiet, weathered old waterman named Josiah Cobb. A man everyone in Larkspur Landing simply called Captain Cobb, though he had never served in any navy and did not care for the title. Thomas Marsh had been the captain's hired hand and, in time, something closer to a son, for Cobb had no children of his own and Thomas had no father left living. It was from Captain Cobb that Thomas learned to read the river's moods, to know a sandbar by the color of the water above it, to splice a rope so it would never fail a man mid-current. And it was Thomas who passed that same patient, exacting knowledge down to Adeline, teaching her to whittle a peg joint before she could properly write her letters. Teaching her that a boat built true would forgive 100 small mistakes but a boat built careless would forgive none. Her mother, Ruth, had died when Adeline was 7, of a fever that swept the river towns that autumn, and it was Captain Cobb, more than anyone, who had helped hold the small family together in the years after. He would come to supper on Sundays with a jar of honey or a length of good rope as a gift, and he would tell Adeline stories of the river in the old days, before the railroads, when a ferry crossing was the only way for miles to get a wagon of grain to market, and a ferryman's word was worth more than a bank's promise. He told her once, with a seriousness she did not fully understand until many years later, that a river crossing was not merely a business, it was a promise a man made to his neighbors. That no matter how poor they were, no matter how late the hour, he would carry them across. Captain Cobb, she would later learn, had kept that promise more faithfully than anyone in Larkspur Landing ever fully knew. Thomas Marsh died when Adeline was 15, thrown from a wagon on the frozen river road in a February storm, and it was in the aftermath of that grief that her mother's older half-brother, Warwick Marsh, arrived from St. Joseph to help settle the affairs, as he put it, of a shop and a modest house that Thomas had owned outright. Warwick was a narrow, calculating man who ran a hardware concern 2 towns over and had never, in Adeline's memory, sent so much as a Christmas letter before her father's death made him suddenly urgently attentive to the family's affairs. He moved into the house within a month, installed himself as the proprietor of the boat repair shop though he knew nothing of boats, and allowed Adeline to remain only as an unpaid keeper of his household, cooking, mending, scrubbing floors that had once been hers. For 3 years she endured it, telling herself it was temporary, telling herself her father would have wanted her to keep the peace. All the while quietly continuing the one part of her education that Warwick could not take from her, on the evenings he was away at the tavern. She would slip down to the riverbank with her father's old tools and practice the boatwright's craft in secret, keeping her hands sure, keeping alive the only inheritance that mattered. It was in the same years that Captain Cobb's health began to fail, and with no family of his own. And with the ferry business long since ruined, a ruin we will come to shortly, he lived out his final seasons in a rented room above the mercantile. Visited faithfully by Adeline whenever Warwick's back was turned. Cobb died the winter Adeline turned 17, and at his sparse funeral, attended by fewer than a dozen souls. She alone among the mourners understood that something had died with him that the town had never properly mourned, a way of caring for one's neighbor that had gone out of fashion along with the ferry itself. She did not yet know how directly her own fate was tied to his. She knew only that she missed him, and that the values he'd spoken of, patience, craft, and the quiet keeping of promises, had settled into her like a keel settles into a hull, invisible, but holding everything else true. The fall, when it came quickly, the way a rotted plank gives way all at once though it has been rotting for years. In the spring of 1888, Warwick Marsh announced, without warning and without asking, that he had sold the house and the shop to St. Joseph investor and intended to return upriver, taking the proceeds with him. He informed Adeline of this the same way he might inform a hired girl that her services were no longer required, standing in the doorway of the kitchen she had scrubbed 1,000 times. His hat already in his hand. When she asked, her voice shaking with a fury she had swallowed for 3 years, what was to become of her father's shop, her father's tools. The only home she had, Warwick told her plainly that she was not blood of his, not truly, being only the daughter of his late half-sister's husband. And that he owed her nothing beyond the month's notice he was, out of what he called Christian charity, providing her now. He allowed her to keep her father's carpentry tools, mostly because the investor had no interest in used implements, and he allowed her, as a final and grudging mercy, to keep the $2.35 that remained of her own small secret savings, money she had earned over 3 years by mending nets and selling wild blackberries at the Saturday market. Hidden inside a hollowed-out chair leg where Warwick had never thought to look. She left the house on a Tuesday morning in October with her satchel, her tools, and her mother's handkerchief holding what little money she had. And she walked into Larkspur Landing not entirely certain where a person went when they had nowhere at all to go. She thought, at first, of asking the mercantile owner for floor space in exchange for work, or of walking to the church and throwing herself on the mercy of the minister's wife. But as she passed the courthouse, she saw a small, weathered notice pinned to the board outside, announcing that the county, having no further use for the derelict property, would sell at auction that very afternoon the old Cobb Ferry Landing, dock, boathouse, and the narrow strip of shoreline it stood upon, to any buyer willing to take on its considerable disrepair and its back taxes, which amounted, mercifully, to almost nothing, since no one in 11 years had thought the land worth claiming. Adeline stood before that notice for a long while, the cold wind coming off the river and finding the gaps in her coat, and she thought of Captain Cobb's hands showing her how to trew a plank. And she thought that she had, in this whole wide and indifferent world, exactly one skill and exactly $2.35, and that perhaps, for once, those two things might be made to fit each other. The auction, when it came, drew almost no interest. The ferry landing had been abandoned since the accident of 1877, was reputed by some of the older townsfolk to be unlucky. And no one wanted the expense of restoring a crossing that the new toll bridge upriver had rendered, in the eyes of most, unnecessary. When the auctioneer, more amused than serious, opened the bidding at $2, Adeline Marsh raised her hand before she had fully decided to do it, and no one else in the small, indifferent crowd raised theirs after her. She walked away that afternoon the owner of a ruin, with 35 cents to her name, and the distinct feeling, shared by every onlooker, that she had made a fool's bargain. She spent her first night as a landowner sleeping in the one dry corner of the old boathouse, wrapped in a horse blanket a sympathetic farmer's wife had pressed on her. Listening to the river move in the dark the way she had listened to it as a girl, and telling herself that a roof with holes in it was still, by definition, a roof. In the grey light of morning she began, out of habit more than any plan, to do what her father had taught her to do with any broken thing. She began at the beginning, and she looked closely. The dock itself was beyond immediate saving, its outer pilings soft with rot, but the boathouse, though weather-stained and sagging, had been built by Captain Cobb's own hands from Good River oak. And Good River oak, Adeline knew, could often be saved where lesser wood could not. She spent that first week simply clearing debris, years of drifted leaves, a fallen section of roof, the nest of some long-departed animal, and it was on the third day. Prying loose a warped floorboard near the old tool bench in order to assess the joists beneath, that her crowbar caught on something that was not wood at all, but iron, the corner of a small, flat strongbox, wedged with evident care into a cavity built directly into the boathouse's foundation timbers. A hiding place so deliberately constructed that Adeline understood at once it had not been an accident of construction, but a decision. Her hands, she would later tell people, shook not from excitement but from a kind of reverence, the sense that she was being permitted to see something Captain Cobb had never meant for careless eyes. The box was locked, the lock long rusted. And it took her the better part of an hour with a chisel and a steady patience she had learned from her father to work it open without destroying what lay inside. What she found was not, as the more excitable tellers of this story sometimes claim, a hoard of gold coin, though there was money in it, a modest sum of silver dollars, perhaps 60 in all, carefully wrapped in oilcloth. What she found, more valuably, was a leather ledger book, its pages filled in Captain Cobb's own careful, slanting hand, and beneath it, folded with the same evident care, a series of letters and a hand-drawn survey map of the landing and the acreage behind it. She read by the light of a tallow candle stub long into that first night, and what she read reshaped, piece by careful piece, everything she thought she understood about the old man she had loved and about the town she had grown up in. The ledger recorded, in a system entirely of Cobb's own devising, the tolls collected at the ferry across some 20 years of operation. And against nearly a third of the entries was written a single word, forgiven, beside the names of families Adeline recognized, widows, laid-off railroad men, freed families newly arrived from the south with nothing but hope and a wagon, drought-broken farmers who could not have paid a nickel toll if their lives had depended on it, which, in truth, some of their crossings had. Captain Cobb, it became clear, had for 2 decades quietly waived the fare for any soul who could not pay, and had made up the difference from his own pocket, all while the town believed, insofar as it thought of him at all, that he was merely a tight-lipped old ferryman scraping by. But the ledger's final pages told a harder story still. In the months before the accident that ended the ferry's operation, Cobb had begun recording, in a hand grown noticeably less steady, a pattern of sabotage, a cut line here, a tampered winch there, and had written, with plain and chilling clarity, his suspicion that the damage was being done deliberately by men connected to Ezra Pruitt, the town's leading banker and financier of the new toll bridge upriver, a man who stood to profit enormously if the free-crossing ferry were removed from competition. The final entry, dated 3 days before the accident that had crippled the ferry and, not long after, Cobb's own health along with it, read simply, "If a thing happens to this ferry that oughtn't, let it be known it was not carelessness. I have written to the county surveyor about the deed and the water rights. Whoever finds this box will know I did not fail my post. I only ran out of road to walk it on." The letters beneath the ledger, several addressed and never sent, filled in what the ledger could only imply. Cobb had discovered, in his final working years, that the original 1841 land grant establishing the ferry crossing carried with it, through an old territorial charter that predated the town's own incorporation, a public water right easement across the entire river bend, meaning that no bridge, toll or otherwise, could legally be constructed within that stretch without either purchasing the ferry landing's rights outright or securing the ferryman's formal release of them. Ezra Pruitt's bridge, Adeline realized with a slow, cold understanding, had been built 11 years earlier on rights that had never actually been properly acquired, rights that Captain Cobb, weakened, disheartened, and without funds to fight a banker in court, had simply been too worn down to contest before he died, and which had passed, unclaimed and unknown to anyone, into whatever hands might one day hold the deed to the old landing. Adeline Marsh, sitting on the floor of a condemned boathouse with $60 silver and a dead man's careful handwriting spread before her, understood with a clarity that felt almost physical that she was not merely holding a curiosity. She was holding the only surviving proof that the town's toll bridge, the very artery of commerce that half of Larkspur Landing now depended upon to cross the river, was standing, quite literally, on a right it had never legally purchased, and that the man who had built it had very likely ruined an old ferryman, and by extension a whole family, to do it. She did not act rashly, for her father had taught her that a hasty repair was worse than none at all. She spent the following weeks doing two things simultaneously, quietly, patiently rebuilding what could be rebuilt of the physical dock, using her father's tools and the last of Cobb's hidden silver to purchase second-hand lumber and nails, sleeping still in the boathouse but sleeping now with a purpose that made the cold more bearable. And, more carefully still, making discreet inquiries, first to the county surveyor's office, where an aging clerk named Mr. Halloway confirmed, with visible surprise, that the old territorial water right records for that bend of the river had never formally been transferred and remained, as best anyone could tell, attached to whoever held clear title to the original Ferry Landing parcel, which was now, astonishingly, a 19-year-old orphan with $2 to her name. Word travels quickly in a small river town, and it did not take long for the fact of Adeline's rebuilding efforts, and the rumor of some old ledger she'd been seen poring over by lantern light, to reach the ears of Ezra Pruitt himself. Pruitt was by then a man well into his 60s, silver-haired and precise in his dress, respected by the town's merchants and feared, quietly, by nearly everyone who owed him money, which was a considerable portion of Larkspur Landing. He came to the landing himself one October afternoon, driven down in a fine buggy, and made Adeline what he called a generous offer, $50, cash in hand, for the deed to the landing and whatever old papers the previous owner might have left behind, an offer, he noted with a thin smile, that was $50 more than the land or its contents were worth to anyone but a sentimental fool. Adeline, standing in the mud in her father's work coat with sawdust in her hair, told him she would think on it, and thanked him for his time, and watched him drive away with the distinct sense that a man does not offer $50 for something worthless. Pruitt's patience did not last. Within a fortnight, Adeline found her small stock of purchased lumber vandalized in the night, and not long after, the county assessor's office sent a curious and unusually urgent notice reassessing the landing's back taxes at a sum Adeline could not possibly pay. A reassessment she would later learn had been quietly requested by a member of the county board who sat, not coincidentally, on the board of Pruitt's bank. Whispers began moving through the town as well, that the Marsh girl was squatting on cursed ground, that Cobb had gone half-mad in his final years and left nothing behind but an old fool's scribblings, that it would be a mercy, really, for someone sensible to take the trouble off her hands. Adeline understood, with a steadiness that surprised even herself, that she was not merely fighting for a piece of land now, but for the truth of a man who could no longer speak for himself, and for a town that did not yet know how much it had already lost. She did not fight Pruitt with money, for she had none, and she did not fight him with anger, though she had cause for plenty. She fought him the way her father and Captain Cobb had taught her to fight a river current, not by struggling against its full force, but by finding the quiet channel where the water itself would carry her true. She went first to Mr. Halloway at the surveyor's office and, with his help, filed the original territorial charter and Cobb's ledger as a matter of public county record, so that whatever happened to her personally, the facts themselves could never again be quietly buried. She went next, not to the bank, but to the very families whose names filled the forgiven columns of Cobb's ledger. Families now grown or scattered but many still living within a day's ride, the Okafor family, freed decades earlier and now prosperous grain farmers upriver, the widow Holbrook, whose husband had died owing nothing to anyone thanks to a ferry crossing Cobb had never charged him for, a dozen others besides, and she told each of them. plainly and without asking for anything in return, what she had found, and what it meant. And let them decide for themselves what debt of memory they might still feel toward the old ferryman who had once carried them across for nothing but the asking. It was the widow Holbrook, in the end, who suggested calling a town meeting, and it was the Okafor family. Arriving by wagon with the old ledger's authenticity already vouched for by their own recollection of Cobb's fairness, who lent the gathering a weight that Pruitt's money could not easily dismiss. The meeting was held in the church hall on a cold evening in late November, and it seemed to Adeline, standing at the front of that crowded room in her father's old coat with the ledger open before her, that half the town had come, drawn by curiosity, by old grievance, by simple hunger to know a story they had half forgotten they'd once lived through. She did not speak long, and she did not speak with anger. She read, in a clear and steady voice, Captain Cobb's own words, his record of tolls forgiven, his suspicion of sabotage, his final plain-spoken line about running out of road to walk. She showed them Mr. Halloway's confirmation of the unclaimed water rights. And she told them, finally, that she had not brought this forward to ruin Ezra Pruitt, nor to claim a bridge toll for herself, but because a good man had been made to look a failure when in fact he had simply been outmatched by someone with more money and less conscience, and she thought the town owed him, at the very least, the truth. Ezra Pruitt, present in the room, attempted at first to dismiss the ledger as the ramblings of a man gone soft in the mind, but Mr. Halloway's calm confirmation of the recorded charter, and the visible, unshakable presence of families like the Okafors and the Halbrooks nodding along with every entry read aloud, left his denials with nowhere solid to stand. He left the meeting that night a diminished man, not ruined by the law, for Adeline had never sought to sue him or drag him before a judge, but ruined in the one currency a man like Pruitt truly depended upon in a small town, the trust and good opinion of his neighbors, which, once broken by the plain weight of the truth, is not easily rebuilt. What Adeline did next was, to some in the town, the most surprising turn of all. She held the water right, and by extension a measure of leverage over the very bridge that half the county depended on, and she could have used it, had she chosen, to demand a fortune from Pruitt's bank or from the county itself. Instead, she proposed something else entirely, brought before that same town meeting a month later. That in exchange for a fair and final settlement releasing the water right to the county for public use, Larkspur Landing would formally restore the ferry crossing under her operation, charging a fair toll but forgiving it, as Cobb once had, for any family too poor to pay, and that a portion of the settlement funds be set aside, in Captain Cobb's name, to establish a small free schoolhouse on the landing's own acreage, so that the children of the town, rich or poor, might have one place at least where nothing was asked of them but their attendance. The county, eager to resolve a legal cloud that threatened its only bridge, agreed within weeks, and by the following spring, the ferry at Larkspur Landing was running again. Its new dock built plank by Adeline Marsh's own hands, its ropes spliced the way her father had taught her, its tolls collected by a young woman who greeted every crossing family by name and who kept, in a plain leather ledger of her own, a column she still, to this day in our story, marks simply, forgiven. And so we return to where we began. To a gray October morning and a girl standing on the courthouse steps with $2.35 and nowhere left in the world to go. We told you then that Adeline Marsh had made what looked to every witness like a fool's bargain, buying a condemned dock that no one else would touch. We told you a secret was sealed there that would change her life and restore a community, and we asked you to trust us until the story was fully told. What Adeline found beneath those rotted boards was never simply money, though the silver helped her survive that first hard winter. What she found was proof that a quiet man's kindness had not been forgotten, only buried, and that the truth, however long it waits, does not spoil the way lesser things do. She could have sold that ledger's leverage for a fortune and left Larkspur Landing forever, and no one honestly could have blamed her for it, given what the town and her own family had cost her. Instead, she chose to spend what she'd found the way Captain Cobb himself would have spent it, on a crossing kept open, a debt forgiven, a schoolhouse door left unlocked for any child who wandered up to it. That, in the end, is the whole of what Adeline Marsh restored, not merely a dock, not merely a bridge's tangled legal claim, but the town's own half-forgotten understanding that value is not always loud, that the most important things are often the ones left quiet, waiting under a warped floorboard, for someone patient enough to look. Thank you for spending this hour with us, and with Adeline Marsh, at the bend of a river in a town that very nearly forgot what it owed to a quiet man's kindness. If her story moved you, we'd be grateful if you'd share it with someone who might need reminding tonight that overlooked things are not always worthless things. We'd love to know, in the comments below, what is a time you found real value in something the rest of the world had already written off, an object, a place, perhaps even a person. We read every story you leave us, and we treasure them. Until next time, stay close.